Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages as they arrive. And in the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the Observer's chief leader writer, Sonia Sodha, and the political journalist, Isabel Oakeshott. Thanks so much for joining us, ladies. More from you both in a moment. Let's see what is on the front of some of those pages. Keep taking the jab, says the PM, as the trial is paused to investigate clot reports, the Guardian's headline referring to concerns over the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. That story also features in the Telegraph, which says that a senior government advisor has suggested that the rollout of the AstraZeneca jab should be paused for young people until regulators are certain it's safe. The Metro hears from the boss of Easyjet, who argues that at up to £420 per person for a battery of COVID tests, only wealthy people will be able to afford to go on foreign holidays this summer. The Mail understands the Prime Minister's asked whether the tests can be accessed less expensively. The Express leads with the PM sticking to the roadmap despite warnings of a third wave. And according to the Financial Times, the investment bank Goldman Sachs spent £75 million propping up shares in Deliveroo after the takeaway firm had an underwhelming debut on the London Stock Exchange last week. Well, tonight we are joined by Sonia Sodha and Isabel Oakeshott. Thanks very much, guys. Let's start with COVID, which inevitably is the main story that we're talking about tonight. On the front of a lot of the pages, Sonia, we're starting though with the Metro page one, and this is the boss of Easyjet saying that it is really going to cost a fortune to go travelling this year because of the cost of COVID tests.
Yeah, so the Metro's looking at the cost of tests to sort of go to popular European destinations. And at the moment, we're looking at sort of between £300 and low £400 per person to go on holiday. And that's obviously a significant amount of money for families. I mean, to be honest, I wouldn't add £400 on the cost of my holiday. I wouldn't be going on holiday this summer, I think. But I think, there is a debate that's going to rage about this. And I guess this is a question of trade-offs, really. So we know that as our vaccination programme gets rolled out, it's going really well so far, touch wood. It's certainly bringing down infection rates, death rates, all very good news. But we know that the biggest risk in some ways to the progress we're making would be a more vaccine-resistant strain of the virus. And, there is certainly a risk of bringing one of those in from a country abroad who has, a less kind of advanced, I suppose, a less progressed vaccine programme than we have. So I think there was a bit of a trade-off here. It's kind of like, do we want to sort of have stricter controls on doing things like going on holiday and stricter sort of provisions around testing, etc., which means that lots of people won't be able to afford to go on holiday this summer? Or do we want to sort of take the risk and go on holiday, but then actually risk way more economic damage later on and a potential kind of third wave where we don't have the vaccines against the virus? So I think that is kind of the trade-off which we're dealing with. I sort of think most people would rather forego their summer holiday than have the risk of another lockdown. So I personally think, I'm very happy to give up a summer holiday if it means that we're safer and we don't have to have another lockdown. We don't have to have more restrictions, and it sort of protects the progress that we've made with the vaccination programme.
It's hard to say, isn't it? And I know that there will be some people who will say actually they're willing to take the risk because they would love a summer holiday. Isabel, what are your thoughts about the front of the Metro? I mean, do you think that this is going to be a realistic cost that will be passed on to travellers, or do you think this is just scaremongering on behalf of Easyjet?
No, I mean, the reality is that these tests are ridiculously expensive, and it would be very interesting to know who is making all the money out of it. I mean, Sonia quoted figures of £300 or £400. As it happens, I'm fairly recently back from a very long period away with my family, and coming back into the UK and meeting all the testing requirements cost me probably about £1,400, and that's for four of us, 3 children and myself. And that's not including the cost of the testing before we travelled. Now, I don't for a minute say that it's not important to have those tests. Of course, people should be testing negative before they get on planes. But the reality is that other countries provide these tests for 30, 40, 50 pounds, not 200 pounds. So this is rip off Britain. And I think we need to look at why these tests can't be provided much more cheaply. And then, of course, there's the issue of the long quarantine that's required when you return. Again, a very important thing, but I think it's immensely off-putting. I certainly won't be booking a foreign holiday this summer with any confidence or enthusiasm. I think I would just stay in the UK because it's just not realistic. And at any point, the government may change the status of your destination.
I mean, Sonia, in terms of the cost of these tests, I mean, as somebody with kids at school, we're offered 2 free tests per family member per week, as well as the child. So the government seems happy on one hand to provide free tests for huge swathes of the population, and also saying they want all the population to be tested twice a week. Why then can't those tests be used as your test when you go abroad and your test when you come back?
Well, as I understand it, there's a difference between the tests. So I think the tests that you get when your child's at school are lateral flow tests. So they're tests that give a really quick result, but they are less accurate than the PCR, the gold standard tests that are what's used to test people when they're coming back from travelling. I think that's absolutely right and appropriate, actually. It's much more important to get kids back to school than people go on a summer break. And we're taking a risk with kids going back to school and using PCR tests. And that is okay. It's a calculated risk. It's one that we need to take because it's so important to have children back in school. I personally don't feel the way about summer holidays, and I think probably most of the country doesn't.
Isabel, it is the front of the Mail that Boris Johnson seems to believe that he can make these tests, these gold standard PCR tests, cheaper. If they were cheaper, would that encourage you to maybe think about it? Or would the quarantine still put you off?
Of course you can make them cheaper because other countries are doing it. I mean, I know that for a fact that they're available for 30, 40, 50 pounds a pop elsewhere as opposed to 4 times that amount here. So, you know, absolutely, it ought to be possible to come to an arrangement where they are provided at that kind of level. But I just think it's far too risky. I mean, you know, the government doesn't give a lot of notice before changing the status of countries, and that's because they have to be quite fleet of foot according to what's going on in individual countries and their own emergent strains that the government is picking up on. So I just think it's far too high risk, and it is awful and it's deeply disappointing that people can't go away, but it does seem to me too risky. And I just think, reading between the lines, it's not really going to be a viable option for most people this side of the autumn.
Well, certainly not if it's £400 per person and you've got a family. Let's move on to The Guardian now. This also talking about COVID, but looking at the efficacy of the AstraZeneca jab. And of course, this evening, Sonia, we've heard that the tests on children are being paused. AstraZeneca are saying that they haven't got concerns, but that it's belt and braces. They're just going to pause it and wait for a few days until they hear from the regulator.
Yeah, and I understand why people might feel concerned if they hear this, but I don't think people should feel concerned. You know, this is a precaution. It's absolutely the right thing to do. While the MHRA is exploring these incredibly rare cases, it has to be said, of clots. And, you know, so as a precaution, they're pausing the pediatric trial. And I think, you know, that's right. No one would want it to go ahead. But it doesn't mean that the AstraZeneca vaccine is dangerous, for example. I think the experts are very clear that at the moment, the MHRA, so our medical regulator, the World Health Organization, other international medical regulators are saying that the benefits of sort of rolling out the AstraZeneca vaccine far outweigh any small risks. A lot of vaccines come with very tiny risks, sometimes of quite serious disorders. We're still learning about AstraZeneca, but the number of cases are absolutely tiny and the benefits are immense. So I think, you know, the MHRA is looking at the data, they're understanding it. You know, there's a chance that at some point in the future, they may make a different decision, for example, for particular age groups, but that's not where they are yet. And, you know, I trust the experts involved with the medical regulator.
And Isabel, I mean, do you think this is going to put people off? It's certainly not the case, you know, when you rock up at your surgery or wherever it is you're able to go and get your vaccine, that you get to pick which one you have. But it is a problem for the reputation of the vaccine, isn't it? It does seem that the
Absolutely. Looking at the politics of this, if I were in Downing Street tonight, I would be pretty concerned about the headlines in tomorrow's papers and the very fact that we're talking about it here. People aren't going to hear the vanishingly tiny statistical chances, something like 1 in 2.5 million, we think, of any kind of complication relating to blood clots. They're just going to hear possible side effects involving blood clots and that vaccine. And I think it will absolutely add to the fears that some people already have about a vaccine they think has been rushed through, just an instinctive thing. So I think there are real concerns about really the amount of publicity that is being given to the halting of this trial. And it being somewhat sensationalised.
Because, of course, Sonia, I mean, the risk of a very, very small risk of blood clots exists in all sorts of different medications that people might take. Are you concerned, Sonia, about the fact that this vaccine was developed as the vaccine that was going to be sold at cost, it was going to help the developing world? Do you think there is now a danger that some countries might turn their noses up at it?
Well, I thought we've already seen some countries actually politicking about it. We've seen Emmanuel Macron politicking about AstraZeneca, which I think is really to be deplored, to be honest.
I'm sorry, I was thinking more about developing world countries, you know, not necessarily the countries that have, you know, got the ability to choose and afford them.
I think most countries will look at the record of the vaccine and will very much kind of want it. I think it's an amazing thing that it's been developed to be sold at cost. I think, you know, Isabel raises there's a really interesting point here, which is about how upfront are you with the public about, you know, what's going on with this vaccine and with vaccine trials. And I think you do need to be upfront because otherwise, you know, people feel like there's something being covered up. It would be awful if the pediatric trial was suspended, for example, and it wasn't reported, but word got out and people thought that there was a conspiracy theory. But you have to quite finely judge that, because I think you really have to be honest with the public, but you have to have experts on TV talking about how small the chances are and how actually lots of vaccines have very small chances, very, very tiny chances of side effects, but the benefits far, far, far outweigh the risks. So I do think there is a tricky thing here. Isabel's right around public health communications. How are you completely upfront and truthful with the public while at the same time keeping risks in proportion? I think that is genuinely quite a difficult public health communication.
And it is
challenge.
so important. You're absolutely right. Well, lots more to come after the break. Coming up, we're going to be talking a little bit about vaccine passports. Is that the way to get the hospitality sector and the economy more broadly up and running? We'll discuss that next. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me now, Sonia Sodha and Isabel Oakeshott. And we're going to kick off this half with the inside of the Financial Times, Isabel. And this is about, well, some people call them vaccine passports, others call them immunity certificates. This is about whether or not having a bit of paper that says that you are pretty safe, either from passing on COVID or catching it, is going to become part of normal life. Will it, do you think?
Well, I was quite struck by this editorial in the FT, particularly the way they call it immunity certificates, as if that's some kind of slightly softer way of describing what is potentially a very insidious measure. The FT, of course, represents all sorts of business communities, the majority of whom, and this is, of course, a generalisation, are anti the idea of people having to show an immunity certificate, or rather a vaccine passport, to access, for example, hospitality, cinemas, theatres, sports stadiums, and so on. But the FT is arguing that this is a sort of necessary evil, if you like. In fact, they're actually softer than that. They seem to sort of slightly shrug off all the concerns about this system and say, actually, you know, this is a reasonable price to pay for getting back to some form of normality. I think a lot of people can get their heads around the idea of having a vaccine passport for international travel. And if it would spare us all those costly COVID tests and quarantining, then I could see the upside in that. But I think there are real deep concerns about requiring it for access to many other things. And I think it has the potential to become very socioeconomically divisive and regressive. And there's a huge political row brewing over this, very substantial opposition to it on the Tory benches, and still pretty unclear where Labour stands on it. A lot of flip-flopping going on there.
So, Sonia, do you think it's an insidious measure?
I'm a lot more sympathetic to this idea than Isabel. I'm very sympathetic to it in principle. I think if it allows us to open up more quickly, I've got no problem. I've not obviously been vaccinated yet. Well, not obviously, but I am too young.
Just because
to
you're
be
so
vaccinated.
fabulously young. Stop rubbing it in.
I just realised. Well, you never know what medical conditions people have, etc. But I haven't been vaccinated yet. But I've got no problem with people who have been vaccinated getting access to things like pubs before me. I guess I do have a couple of practical concerns. And I think this is actually why Labour hasn't come out with a clear line yet, because it wants to see how these practical things would work. So first of all, I do think there are probably some quite significant privacy concerns around this. And do we trust the government with this incredibly sensitive data? So I think there's that question. And secondly, I just think, my God, the COVID app last summer was so bad. So I just do wonder if there's a competency issue here. Can the government get this right? But in principle, I'm not opposed to it.
But Isabel, I mean, those are the kind of the logistical, practical reasons that people are against it. But Isabel, you are against it much more morally, it seems. I mean, there are those who will say, well, look, you only need one of these if you're going somewhere out of choice. You don't need this to go to the supermarket. You don't need this to go to the shops. As if you're going to a concert, if you're going to somewhere that you want to go, it's not something that's being forced on people, is it?
Well, it couldn't be forced on people because that would be against all human rights legislation. I mean, this is what came out of Nuremberg. They can't do that. But I don't think that's any great reassurance. And I don't think we should shrug off the practicalities. I mean, thinking about the time frame of this, it would be entirely unreasonable to introduce this before everybody has been offered the vaccine. And I don't think that's going to be realistically until everyone's had both jabs. It's not going to be until at least the autumn. And then when the vast majority of the population have had their jabs anyway, I don't really see why it would be needed. So I think it is the wrong solution to a problem that hopefully won't actually exist, except in terms of international travel.